I could be an elder in the Mormon church. Absolutely. It makes you wonder sometimes. And it seems like the world kind of goes in cycles. When God says something, they say, oh yeah, that's a really good thing. We should do exactly what God says. Then they say, I think God was wrong about that. And I think it's better my way. Then it always seems like eventually they say, oh, maybe God was right. Well, then it goes back to the concept of pride. The works that men put together, they want to be right, and they want to agree with certain things in the scriptures, but when it comes down to it, do they want them to be right or God to be right? Usually them. Okay. The next qualification then that we see in this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 3 that we need to discuss here is in verse 7. It says, moreover, he must have a good testimony. And we've looked at the concepts of being blameless, or one who's not quarrelsome, and things along that line. But this idea comes out once again. He must have a good testimony. And most of the things that we have discussed and studied about the qualifications for an elder, about the type of person they are, and the reputation that he has, have been internal among the members. But notice where this testimony is among. What does that say in verse 7? Where is this testimony to be found? Outside. Now, why should this testimony be among those who are outside?
We see them 3 times a week. People who work with us.
Absolutely. Many preachers have used the illustration, it's easy to be a Christian inside the building, right? And they've used the illustrations of a light switch, turn it off and on, easy to do, 2 or 3 times a week. But that's right. The testimony should be seen because people see him every single day.
If he doesn't have a good report of those out.
Right, and that's another piece to that. Because if he's bringing reproach on the church in the world, how is he going to bring people to Christ? It's not going to happen. That is why it's so important to have a good testimony. Whenever you ask people who know an individual in the world, what type of person is this? And they start to say that he can't speak without dirty words coming out of his mouth. If he is always going to look for a fight with somebody, the list can go on and on and on. Would you say he has a good testimony? Right. And so that's why it's also important to not only do your homework on the person that is considered to be an elder within the church, but here we see a piece of information to do a little bit of searching. What is this person like outside the church? And here's why that's important. Compared to the time that we spend with people in the world and time that we spend with the congregation during a week, where do we spend most of our time? Right, so they are going to see more about us, more about who we are, than even our church family does it sometimes. That's why it's important to have a good testimony. And a Christian, every Christian should walk in wisdom towards those who are outside. We've looked at that passage in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 many times. So we must walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, who have a good testimony among them. I was doing a little bit of research on this Greek word in the original language about this testimony. I think And that idea of that definition for that word is a witness, or even giving evidence based on a reputation and the evidence that is presented. What do people call on witnesses for? To testify, right? The question was, what do people call on witnesses for? And it's to testify. And they're testifying of what should be the truth. Doesn't always happen. But they are supposed to give the best account that they can and the evidence that they have about something. In a passage that I would encourage you to read later on would be seen. The testimony of this man would be in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 11. It can be seen not only in just an elder, but it should be seen in every Christian, in the way that they live. Any comments or questions about a testimony?
Yeah. Everything here.
Right?
Oh, new Christian.
Absolutely. And it's something that he needs to work to grow. And a good testimony, a new Christian even can begin to have that. It's going to take time based on different backgrounds of life where they came from. It might take time to build up a good testimony. What do we say about trust? Or maybe I just had it in my mind. It's hard to get, but really easy to lose. Really easy to break trust, and it takes a really long time to regain somebody's trust. Same thing with the testimony. So if an elder, somebody who's being considered for an eldership, has a good testimony, he's probably been very consistent in the way that he lives. Okay, the next qualification, we need to jump back. Again, it is one that we'll spend the concept of having faithful children. There is much discussion, many different ideas about this in the religious world. Some will say it's this, some will say it's that, some will say, no, you're wrong, and some will make it even a test of fellowship at times. This is an interesting question and probably one of the most controversial subjects in the New Testament, sadly. It's probably rank up there with one of the others, like the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. People say, well, he does. The question is how. But this is one of those that has been argued about many times. But back up in verse 4, it says, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For this one, I'd like us also to jump over to the book of Titus, Titus chapter 1, and can somebody read verse 7?
Did he be blameless? The husband wife had faithful children, not accused of last word.
Okay, so we see the command, and that is to have the children in submission, and that they must be faithful, and there are some other qualifications for the children there also. So thinking about why the children should be faithful. Why is it necessary to have the children, first of all, in submission? Jumping back over, we're going to do a little bit of jumping between these two passages. Back over in 1 Timothy chapter 3, it says in verse 5, there's an explanation given for why the house must be in order and the children to be in submission with all reverence in verse 4. And the reason is given in verse 5, for if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he care for the church of God? Very important, and we will come back to that later. But by looking at the house of an elder, you can see his leadership in the action that he takes, and also in the long-term leadership that he is with. Qualification for children, the faithful or the believing children, there are two main ones. And they are as follows. There are some who believe that all the children should be faithful in the household and continue to be faithful. And there are some who will say, well, as long as there is a plurality, they will say that man could be an elder. And we will get into this a little bit, but as I've been studying this and looking at the idea of the faithful children, I was looking at some of the tenses in Titus chapter 1, verse 7. And to instate the elder, first of all, they must have believing children in the present tense, so it's happening at the time. It is also in the present tense for the word having in Titus chapter 1. So it is happening at the time that he is an elder, and that his children are faithful. But how many children does it say in the text? Right. It says children. Doesn't say one. Doesn't say four. Doesn't say however many. There's no number given. And I've talked to different people and heard different sides, different explanations about this. And the conclusion that I have come to personally is that there is a way that you know is always safe, and that you will always be right. There is no question about whether a man should be an elder. And that is if the children are all faithful in the house. And we'll look at some reasons why. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I did. There's some folks that say that you have 3 kids and one of them's not faithful. An elder show me the exception. Where does it say all for one and all for two? And that's a man-made thing because I know people that serve as elders had one faithful child. They had 4 kids. But, you know, nothing tells me that he is going to be unfaithful. Feel good. I've been told myself that I could be an elder because I've got 2 faithful children. I haven't found anywhere in the Bible says all of the one. What about somebody that has children?
Right. Trust me. Right, and so I was looking at this idea over this week, and here's one reason I kind of came to this conclusion once again. How much wine should an elder be given to? None. What about other substances? We've discussed this. What about the other substances that would be harmful or addicting to the body in the same way that alcohol would be? Okay, so should an elder really be given to that at all? Okay. What about the idea of a quarrelsome person? Should that be his lifestyle? What about the idea of a sober mind? Who should be that person? To me, logically, it's hard to say, well, he should not have any wine in his life. He had better, if you're just to read Titus chapter 1, to be a blameless man, the husband of one wife, and then jumping down to be blameless, not self-willed, not quick-tempered. It's hard logically for me to say, well, if he can't have any of those, why are we going to change the logic here and say, well, it's okay on this one? Does that make sense? Like to say that he should not be given to these substances at all, and then to say, well, as long as he has a plurality of children. But why should the children be Christians? If they were just believing, that there's another group or study out there. I'll put this out there for your information. There is another teaching out there that says, well, they don't have to be Christians at all. All they have to do is believe in God. Well, here's why that wouldn't make any sense scripturally to me. How is your faith seen? James chapter 2. How is your faith seen in James chapter 2? By your actions, by your works. And that has been described in a way that has always stuck with me. Think about if you are sitting in a boat, in a rowboat, and you're supposed to have two oars. And one is faith or belief, and the other one is works. And you threw the works as far as you could, and you only had one oar. And you rowed as hard as you could with that faith oar. What are you going to do? It's going in circles. You need both, right? Your belief and your faith is shown by your action. Now, how would that be seen? Right, and the children, their faith would be seen in action, and that would be based off what the scriptures say in obedience to that. Do you have something, Chester? Right, and also the man in his household, right? And if an elder is doing the proper godly job to lead his household in the right way, what are all the principles going to be in that household based on? Godly principles. So if they were to reject everything that the man said in his house and the authority there, they would also be rejecting God.
Elders were the children them have to be living in home. Say that believing children are faithful. Because the rule is on how it goes. So if my children, if all three of my children were faithful Christians, that shows I have done the job that could be done. If I haven't been my children in
and why we might say all the children should be faithful. I'd like you to turn over with me to the book of, let me find it here, 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. There is a severe responsibility for an elder. We've seen that in the very first lesson that we studied together. How they are supposed to imitate the best example, the chief shepherd, 1 Peter chapter 5. They have an important responsibility, one of the greatest responsibilities put on them in the world. And they have a job to not only shepherd the flock properly, but they are also to make sure there is no place for reproach to be brought on the religion of Christianity and even God. But in 2 Samuel, chapter 12, in verse 14, it says, and this is in the context of Nathan coming to David, and he had called him out for the sin. And this was a public sin. It was done against God, but also against Uriah, and even Bathsheba, even against himself. You can see the studies about that. And even by doing so, the king, by sinning against God, could have committed fault against the nation. Okay, now read with me what verse 14 says of 2 Samuel chapter 12. However, by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. This is in context of Nathan and coming to David about the things he had done. He had committed adultery with Bathsheba, but he had presented an occasion for the enemies of God to blaspheme. Bruce, did you have something? Oh, okay, thank you. I mentioned this a few times, I believe even last week. The fishbowl effect, what was that? You see what's inside. Now, what do we tend to do to politicians? We are looking. We are looking for something good that lines up with what we believe and what we think should be happening. But what about those people that maybe we don't agree with? We're looking, aren't we? People in general are looking. They want to tear down whoever and however they can with whatever they find. Now, based on the blamelessness of an elder, what he should be as a person, what if half of his children were unfaithful? How would that line up with the good testimony from some who might say outside, well, your family doesn't even believe what you believe? You see the problem? Why should he convince me, right? And that is why I think it connects very well to the rebuke that Nathan gave David. You have given the enemies of God an occasion to blaspheme. That's why I think it connects very well. And that's why the children should be faithful. But also, it gives a reputation. We say actions speak louder than words. Well, the actions of that person, the actions of the children reflect on that parent, right? I've heard the statement given by people. My parents didn't really use this with us that much, but other people have given this illustration about if they would go out as a young person, they would say something, remember your name. And why would that be the case? Right. And so if the name is in danger of being damaged, and you can understand that from a physical concept, what about if the elder is in a position where his children are bringing reproach on him outside? How is that going to be a good thing? How is that going to reach souls? It would be very hard to cross that gap, especially what we just studied with the good testimony. You can see passages such as Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, to see why the children should be qualified, why they should be taught, and it's so that they don't fall away and even bring reproach. You can see in Judges chapter 2, verses 7 through 10, that same principle about what happened with the following generation that arose after the rulers, and they did not know the Lord. And you can see in verses 11 and following of Judges chapter 2, right after that statement is made, what happened. Going back to what we're studying, the faithful children, we can see, and there's always, once again, what I keep coming back to is it doesn't say a number. We can see logically and even scripturally why it would be a good thing for all the children to be faithful. But always, my mind keeps coming back to, well, there is a way that you know 100% is correct. With no question in your mind, with no question in the mind of anybody in the congregation, no question also in the mind of anybody outside. Those things make sense? Okay. Don't want to confuse. Time, Bruce? Okay. There you go, you found it. Okay, we will pick up here and we will look at the concept of ruling his house well. We've seen the necessity and the qualification for children. We'll come back to just a little bit of that, how they should not be accused of dissipation or insubordination, different definitions that are used in different translations. We'll look at that concept, and then we'll also look at the necessity, just a little bit more, of the way the house should be run scripturally for an elder.
One person says that faithful children be faithful in the family. Paul was writing about
well, and also if you connect it to the concepts of dissipation and insubordination, and also being in reverence not only to the Lord but also to the family, it would go against Scripture also. So we'll come back to that next week. All right, thank you very much for your attention and your participation this evening. Yeah.
There are things. I think it's Good evening. Your mic is- Few announcements we need to make. We'd like to welcome everybody here this evening, but we'll remember those on our refer list. Lynn's sister, Donna Allen, Wes and his family, Holly Richardson, and those in the military and our youth. Thursday nights, What the Bible Says will be live at 7 o'clock p.m. If my memory serves me right, How Can I Live a Godly Life in This Evil World? Something like that anyway.